Share via email. Report story. Chapter 5. Izuku shot away from under the villain's outstretched arms, green lightning flashing around the room as he activated one for all throughout his entire body. At the same time, Tsuyu shot her tongue out and wrapped it around the villain's midriff, the tension causing the villain to be yanked backward. Aizawa sent his capture weapon after Izuku and Ochako, the metal bindings just barely missing the pair before they hit the wall. Just before impact, Izuku turned his body so that his back felt the full force of the collision as his power threw him around the small room, which did not give him enough space to use his quirk effectively. Ochako whimpered softly as Izuku's arms jerked at the sudden impact of the collision. Izuku glanced down and softly shifted his arms but leapt away from the wall where he knew he could be cornered if the villain recovered faster than expected. He finally skidded to a stop beside his classmates. Todoroki and Iida quickly moving to stand in front of the pair, Iida shielding them with his arms outstretched on either side of him while Todoroki stood in a more aggressive stance with both arms raised in the air, his hands curled into fists as fire exploded from his left side. The villain had collapsed to the floor and was tangled in Tsuyu's tongue, but he was trying to stand, his many bionic arms attempting to untangle themselves from each other. All of the students stood around their friends, Shoji and Kirishima holding onto Tsuyu's shoulders so that she would not get dragged down with the villain while the other teens set themselves up to protect Ochako and Izuku. The villain propped himself up on his flat palms, his hair dangling in his face as he strained to lift the bottom half of his body off of the floor. "It's over, villain," Aizawa said, his eyes flashing red and his hair raised above his head as he activated his power erasing quirk. "Give up this fight. We are here to claim back one of our top students," he said, his voice filled with icy fire. "And you will not mess with UA ever again." The villain paused in his efforts to stand to look back at Aizawa, his eyes narrowing and his smile starting to falter. His clawed arm tips snapped in frustration, the metal arms still trying to untangle themselves fruitlessly. His eyes darted to his metallic arms, back to Aizawa, and then settled on the students. He saw the frog girl being supported by her friends but standing strong all on her own. The half-and-half teen standing guard over his friends along with a bird boy who stood with a dark, shadow-like creature covering his entire body so that he looked almost twice his size. Then he began to laugh. His laugh filled the entirety of the chamber in a chilling echo that rattled through the bones of the students assembled and made a small trickle of doubt worm its way into their minds. Bakugo whipped around to face the villain, his eyes wide with a bright fury that seemed to match the heat of the room. "What are you so happy about?" Bakugo spat. The villain merely continued to laugh until he could hardly breathe, his chest heaving up and down as he bellowed. "Back down, Bakugo," Aizawa said. This guy is insane. What do you mean? The villain asked, twisting his head around to look at Aizawa directly in the eyes, his laughter ending so abruptly it left the students stunned. I mean you are a psychopath, Aizawa said coolly, his scarf whipping around his face as his gaze intensified on the villain. The villain's face had turned to an expression of stone, his features hardening so that they barely resembled that of a human face anymore. That is a matter of perspective, the villain said. That was when one of his arms shot out towards Aizawa, catching him and restraining him in its iron grip. Everyone had been so focused on the trapped villain that they had not even noticed that one of his more hidden arms had freed itself. Promoted stories. You'll also like I Am sequel of You Are check mark 69.4K 1.8K. This book is the sequel of You Are, so better read that first before going here. Tears of joy, tears of joy. Thank you to that one reader that suggested this title. I can't see you sad face, but thank you. Izuku's Harem Academia 187K 1.7 Qst. Read. Zero Deku Onishots 31.5K 798. Because of circumstances, this book won't be continued unfortunately. Feel free to check out my other stuff. Thank you for understanding. Convicted Hearts 3680. Like my other story but ILI longer. The Hero's Return MHAXJJK, ongoing 114K 1.7K and quad. Izuku. Midoriya, after being betrayed and killed, vanishes leaving hurt people behind. After 2 months and a hack, he come back, changed. How will the class re? Much needed love. Yandere Succubus Momo X Izu. 51.4K 809. After Wattpad had decided to delete this story out of nowhere, I and many reader were distraught. So I'm making a remake of the story from the ground up to compensate. After all, own fluke 11.4K 802. Will edit once I'm free. N. This is a work of fiction, and any similarity with other works is purely coincidental. Excuse grammatical errors and misspellings. Eng. Aizawa. Shoji called, running towards their teacher who was beginning to cough as the strength of the metal claws began to make it difficult for him to breathe, his ribs cracking painfully under the pressure. Shoji, no. Hiroshima called out to his friend, one hand releasing Suyu to reach out towards Shoji. That was when the villain noticed the weak spot and reached around with his other untangled arm, grasping Suyu's tongue and yanking hard. Ribbit! Suyu cried out in surprise as she was whipped from her spot on the ground and was slammed into the wall behind the villain. Detangling himself from her tongue, the villain was able to fully stand up, rolling his shoulders back until they satisfyingly popped. Now this is much better. The villain called out happily just as Tokiyami rushed over to Suyu. Sue, are you all right? He asked frantically, kneeling beside her and placing a hand on her arm. Yes, I'm all right, Ribbit, she said, allowing him to help her stand up although Suyu was recovering. The loss of Tokiyami's position brought about more positions for the villain. With his metal arms acting almost of their own accord, he twisted to avoid a fire attack by Todoroki and focused all of his energy on Yaoyorozu, who had created several small metal guard walls and a shield. About 6 of his arms struck out at Momo, their teeth snapping as the creativity girl twirled and twisted to avoid his attacks. Even with the guards, it was just too much to focus on. Finally, the arms broke through the walls and rained attacks down on Yaoyorozu, never pausing in their strikes so that Momo could not recover or even create more shields. Yaoyorozu! Todoroki yelled, leaping forward with a fresh fire attack that enveloped the villain entirely. No sound came from the burning villain, and so after a few moments, Todoroki relaxed his body and allowed his quirk to die out. Once the fire had ceased into nothing, Todoroki and Yaoyorozu were shocked to find that the villain was gone. Just gone. The pair frantically looked around, their eyes scanning every corner for the 8-armed villain. Nothing stirred in the room except for the metal arm that was still trying to crush Izawa. The end of the arm was lying on the ground, the exposed wire end sparking feebly while the rest of the arm worked as if it were still attached to the body. Todoroki, Izuku said, still cradling Ochako to his chest. Did you just? Nobody responded and still, nothing stirred. That was when Izuku felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. The green-haired boy whirled on the spot, careful not to stir Ochako too much even given the situation. That was when he saw a glimmering form of liquid metal rising from the ground. It twirled and twisted and rose far above Izuku's head. Then the metal started to take form, a head and body shaping from the liquid metal as if it were being carved in real time just before their eyes. The figure finally crashed to the floor, his body entirely solid metal. Although his form slightly resembled that of Tetsu from Class 1B, he also looked much more terrifying with completely flawless metal face features but sharp edges that coated his arms, chest, and legs. He looked as though he were made of knives and swords everywhere except for on the face. His hair was non-existent in this form, only a shiny bald head was exposed, gleaming even in the gloom. This transformation happened in only a few seconds, giving Izuku just enough time to set Ochako on the ground behind him before the enemy was on top of him, his remaining metal claws raising in the air menacingly. Izuku dropped his body over Ochako, using himself as a human shield as the villain clawed at him in an attempt to get to her. He screamed as one of the metal claws sliced through his side but grit his teeth and curled his arms around her body even tighter. Suddenly the weight was lifted from his back and he glanced up to see Shoji, thrusting himself forward as his many arms wrestled with the metal claws of the villain. The villain snarled like an animal and viciously tried to slash at Shoji only for metal to meet metal as his claws collided with Ida's hero costume. The hit should have sent the engine hero flying to the side but Ida had prepared for the attack by firing up the engines in his legs so that when the hit collided with him, he did not go far. As soon as Iida stopped sliding to the side, he used the remaining power in his legs to sprint at the enemy, locking arms with one of the claws while Shoji fought with two more. Run, Midoriya! Shoji and Iida both shouted as they swung around the villain, twisting around his attacks and using their shared strengths to outpace him. Izuku was already ahead of them, his quirk sending him shooting across the room. He had picked Ochako back up again and had carried her quickly away from the fights that had sprouted up throughout the room, various students fighting his many robotic arms. Tokiyami, Kirishima and Sue were trying to help pry Aizawa from the death grip of one claw while also trying to fight off another arm at the same time. Yaoyorozu, Todoroki, and Bakugo were fighting two more together, using more of Momo's shields and a cannon as well as Bakugo's and Todoroki's fire powers to fend them off. Izuku looked around frantically, his mind a whirl of decisions and consequences. He wanted so badly to help his friends, to give them the upper hand, but at the same time, he refused to leave Ochako as it was his fault she had been captured in the first place. His eyes finally locked on a shaded corner of the room, sheltered by many of the broken cabinets and scrap metal that was piled on the floor. Jumping at the opportunity, he made a decision that he hoped he would not regret later. Using his quirk, he bounded to the spot in just two strides and immediately shut off his quirk, not wanting the flashy lightning to attract attention to the spot. Once he was sure he was hidden by the rubbish and the narrow walls, he leaned Ochako against the wall and shrugged off the top half of his hero costume. It was torn and caked in dust, but it was better than nothing. He folded the jacket into a thicker, more comfortable object and set it on the ground between two dull pieces of scrap metal. He realized how lucky he was that it was hot in the room rather than cold, as he didn't think he would have been able to keep her warm if it had been obnoxiously cold instead. Picking Ochako up once more, he held her close to him for a fraction of a second, contemplating his decision. I can't lose you again, he whispered into her ear, a few stray tears sliding down his cheeks as he held her, one hand on her lower back and the other on the back of her head so that she was completely snuggled up against him. Never again, he said. Then he lowered her gently onto his jacket so that it served as a makeshift pillow. After making sure that she was as comfortable as she could possibly be, he stood up. She would have looked peaceful if not for her wounds, he reflected. Then a determined light entered his eyes and Izuku spun around, pretending to ignore the fact that his best friend was lying helplessly in this corner behind him. He got to the edge of the wall, his bare back pressed against it as he prepared to leap out when something made him freeze in his tracks. You won't lose me. A small, weak voice floated to him from behind the debris. Chapter 6. Ochako's pounding head woke her up. The pain was striking her head like a mallet, hitting harder and harder until she slowly rose back into consciousness. When she did come to, the whirl of motion around her nearly sent her back into unconsciousness. Her eyes fluttered open and closed, but she didn't have the energy to keep them open. She knew that she was sitting up, although she didn't know how, and she knew that someone was moving around in front of her, but that was as far as her brain was able to process. Suddenly, she felt strong calloused hands lift her from the ground and hold her close to their body, their grasp on her gentle and kind. She heard the sound of someone crying, sobs drifting from the mouth of her rescuer ever so softly. So softly, in fact, that she thought she was imagining the sounds at first, maybe imagining her rescuer entirely. But then one of those gentle hands stroked the back of her head and held her close, whispering to her words of comfort. I won't lose you again. Her brain managed to snag from the voice. Never again. That was when her brain recognized the voice. Her eyes opened a little bit wider than they had been able to before when she realized that the person she was snuggled up against was none other than her best friend and crush since the sports festival at UA. Deku. She would have gasped or hugged him back if she had had the strength, but she barely had the strength to keep her eyes open, so she had to sit still as her hero lowered her back onto the ground, nestled between some rubble and laid her head on a soft, square object. She watched as he stood up, casting one last sad but determined glance in her direction, and walked to the edge of the wall that was concealing them. She felt her strength start to return in very small doses as she realized what situation they were in. The metallic rubble everywhere, the rush of motion in every corner, the sounds of yelling and screams. They were not free yet, not as she had originally thought. She glanced back at Izuku and saw his legs bend, about to leap into the fray outside of the wall. Ochako slightly began to panic, he was about to go fight. He had saved her and she had done nothing. Forcing all of her energy to her lips, she spoke softly. You won't lose me. She would have been worried that he had missed the small sentence if he had not frozen like a deer in the headlights when the sound drifted to his ears. She saw him whirl around to face her, more tears streaming down his face. You are awake. He managed to gulp after a few moments, his eyes shining with something that Ochako could not read at that moment. Barely. She managed to croak out. Izuku trotted back over to her, careful not to make any unnecessary noise as he bounded over the debris. He kneeled down and pulled her back up into his chest, giving her a soft hug so as to avoid causing her any extra pain. She did have to fight the urge to flinch as pain shot up her leg at the movement, but she needed this and did not want to scare him away, so she sat still and allowed him to hold her, her own eyes watering at his touch. Deku, she murmured, happy that she did not have to raise her tired voice. Shish, don't speak, he whispered back. Save your strength, Ochako. Despite herself, a bolt of lightning shot down her spine at his use of her first name. At that moment, she was grateful for the gloom as a bright blush rose in her cheeks. She knew it wasn't the time, but she couldn't help but feel electric when Izuku was around. Thank you, she whispered despite his warning. She felt his arms tighten around her a little, and she gave his knee a little squeeze in return as this was as far as she was able to lift her hand without pain. He finally released her and held her at a distance, his eyes scanning over every surface of her face and finally landing on her eyes and hanging there. She held his gaze even though her blush intensified. I will get you out of here, but right now I have to help our classmates. Stay here, and stay out of sight. He lowered her once more on top of the makeshift pillow and stood up. He walked quickly back to where he had been by the wall and peered around the corner at the action on the other side. Once he had confirmed that there was an opening for him, he turned back to Ochako. Stay safe for me, I can't live without you. Before Ochako could say anything in response, he activated his quirk with a flash of green lightning and leapt out from behind the wall with an angry yell. Ochako stayed where she was supposed to for a little while, but the calls of her classmates as they fought the terrifying villain was almost too much to bear. Bracing herself, she strained every muscle in her lower body until she was able to push herself into a sitting position. By the time she was able to sit up on her elbows, she was panting hard and the pain was shooting in a non-stop current up and down her side and legs. She could barely move, but she couldn't just lay there either. She inched her elbows from behind her to sit beside her knees so that she was sitting forward slightly. Gulping hot air into her lungs and gathering whatever courage she had left, she lunged forward into a crawling position. She had to bite her fist to keep from screaming as the blinding pain rocketed through her body like a white-hot flame spreading through a forest, burning her from neck to toe and sending her head swimming. Ochako paused, laying on the ground and panting as she waited for the pain and nausea to pass. It took what felt like hours but eventually cooled down enough for her to begin to think straight again. Swallowing her fear, she looked back at her legs and felt the blood drain out of her face at the mutilated mess she saw instead. Her legs were still there all right, but they resembled two charred logs that had barely survived a forest fire. A high-pitched scream radiated from outside followed by an angry bellow. These sounds caused Ochako to whip her head back to face the front, but it also cleared her head. She had a goal and she had to make it there. Forcing herself to fight through the pain, Ochako reached a hand forward and slapped the metal floor. Tensing her fingers, she dragged herself to meet that hand, gritting her teeth and once again biting her fist until it bled. Struggling against the urge to relax and succumb to the darkness swirling around her vision, she reached her opposite hand out and dragged herself across the floor. She continued this painstaking process until she had managed to get herself to the edge of the wall, her breath ragged and stabbing to her throat as she fought for air against the pain that threatened to swallow her whole. Her fist ached with the pain of her teeth sinking into it, but she finally made it to the wall and found a place to peer out without being seen. What she saw nearly made her forget her pain and rush out to meet her classmates. Aizawa, Su, Tokiyami, and Kirishima were fighting several of the metallic arms which snapped and whirled around the group, lashing at them like furious snakes trying to kill a common enemy. She noticed the way that the ragged group was tiring, but what worried her was the state Mr. Aizawa seemed to be in. He was bleeding from the mouth and his normally exhausted state seemed to be exaggerated a lot more than usual. She had seen him look like this in only one other instance, and that had been during the USJ attack during their first semester at UA. She also saw Todoroki, Bakugo, and Yaoyorozu fighting against a few more claws using shields, a cannon and lots of fire. But the fire was a lot less dramatic than her classmates were usually capable of, and the shields had taken so much damage that they looked like scrap metal picked up from off the floor. Ochako felt her breath hitch as one of the claws whipped around, slamming into one of the battered shields with the force of a truck going 50 miles an hour down a highway. Her ears rang with Yaoyorozu's scream as the shield slammed into her body and threw her against the wall. Tears slid down Ochako's cheeks and she had to place a hand firmly over her mouth to keep from calling out. Yaoyorozu. She heard Todoroki cry out before his voice was cut off as the claws took advantage of the distraction to wrap themselves around his waist and slowly start to constrict him. Bakugo screamed with rage and threw himself at the claws, using large explosions to attack them. Unfortunately for him though, the small space prohibited him from using his usual enormously destructive attacks. The claws took advantage of this and one grabbed him by the ankle while the other wrapped itself around his chest and held his arms out, forcing his explosions to harm his friends rather than the enemy. She couldn't take it. Her friends were injuring themselves in order to protect her while she sat behind this wall, unable to use her useless legs. Her head suddenly snapped up as a flash of green lightning jolted across the room in the form of Izuku, his eyes ablaze of bright fury and determination as he headed straight for the body of the enemy, who was still fighting with an exhausted Shoji and Iida. Iida was thrown against the wall and the enemy charged him, about to strike him to the ground when Shoji dashed in front of the villain, locking arms with him. Shoji's multiple limbs tried to pry at the metallic body, slamming his multiple fists into his body to no avail. Even with his attacks growing weaker and weaker, Shoji was able to provide some recovery time for Iida, who bolted away from the wall and struck with another Recipero burst to the villain's back. But they were losing. Even with Izuku leaping into the fray, the villain was just too strong. Unlike Kirishima's hardening or Tetsu's steel, this villain did not seem to have a time limit no matter how many attacks rained down on him. Not only that, but the villain was able to morph more mechanical arms from his back and sides, forcing Ochako's friends to fight to their very end. Ochako gritted her teeth once more. Anger surged through her veins and her pain felt as if it had been doused in some sort of numbing liquid, allowing her just enough relief for her to pull herself to her knees. She was wobbly and almost black out again, but she held onto the wall and forced herself to remain awake, the energy flooding her body and empowering her to move, to help. She was supposed to be a hero, right? Taking a deep breath, Ochako moved away from behind the wall but remained pressed against the back of the room, staying in the shadows and lying low to avoid detection. Even her fellow students did not see her as she crept behind Aizawa and made her way towards the villain's body. As she crawled, she held her hands out, touching every piece of scrap metal she could find, allowing all five of her fingers to touch the various metals so that a soft pink glow fanned out from the pads on her fingers. She turned another corner and felt a stabbing pain in her side where the bullet rested. She knew she was losing a lot of blood, but the stabbing pain was duller than before thanks to the adrenaline pumping through her veins, so she kept going, pushing herself to the brink. Finally, she reached the villain, hiding in the shadows behind him while he and his claws were distracted by Shoji, Iida, and Izuku. Gathering her courage, she began exercising an aspect of her quirk she had been working on in private for a long time. She had taken many early mornings, before the rest of her class woke up, and had gone to the training grounds to practice a new move she had thought of in a dream. Aizawa had caught her but had decided to help her perfect it instead of prohibiting her when he heard her plan for the move. Remembering Aizawa's encouraging words from practice, Ochako dragged herself out into the light, allowing herself to be seen by the villain. At first, the villain had twirled around to avoid an attack and had nearly missed her, but then he whipped back around and stared at her open mouth. She knew she must look crazy, laying there with her current injuries and preparing to fight, but she stood strong against his menacing glare. Well, well, well. It looks like my trophy wants to have a little bit more fun. He said with a smirk. Iida, Izuku, and Shoji all froze and turned to see Ochako facing against the villain, her legs shaking as her injuries struggled to hold her up, even when she was just on her knees. Ochako, no! Izuku cried out, his voice cracking as he struggled against two of the claws that were still fighting with him. Iida and Shoji also tried to get to her, four more arms fighting Shoji and his many limbs while two occupied Iida. Ignoring the calls of her friends as they screamed at her to get back, Ochako took one more crawl step forward, having to fight to keep from collapsing, and pressed her fingertips together. My new special move, gravity shield followed by torpedo drop. She howled. The pink hue that accented the pads on her fingers faded and disappeared, which resulted in a loud roaring sound coming from above. The villain only had time to look up before every piece of scrap metal began pounding on his head and neck with the force of 1,000 grenades. At first, his metal skin held up, but then it started to weaken and crack under the pressure, eventually failing. The metal retreated from his skin like liquid being poured onto a surface in rewind, revealing his normal human skin. The metal pieces soon struck home, hitting his exposed head and back as well as burying him in scrap metal. As for her friends, her first move, Gravity Shield, had kept them well protected, sheltering them with the old, damaged shields that Momo had created when fighting the claws earlier. A few pieces of metal sliced through the shields and managed to hit her friends, but they were otherwise unharmed. All of the claws that had been fighting with her classmates or attempting to crush them suddenly went limp with their master, releasing her friends and hitting the concrete flooring with a clang. Everyone was silent. Todoroki was sitting by Yaoyorozu, sheltering her with his own flaming body, careful not to burn her. Bakugo was leaning against a wall for support but was leaning down to help up an exhausted Kirishima. Sue was using her tongue to hold Aizawa in the air. He was still conscious but was very injured, while Tokiyami and Dark Shadow supported her from behind. Shoji, Iida, and Izuku lifted the shields from their backs, peering at the surrounding damage before standing up and discarding their protection to the side. Then everyone looked at Ochako. Ochako swayed on her knees, her eyes glazing over as a huge wave of pain cascaded over her senses, causing her to cry out. She suddenly had no strength in her legs and fell towards the ground. She braced herself for a rough, pain-filled landing when bright green light filled the room in a brilliant flash and she felt herself land on something soft and gentle. She still had to bite her tongue to keep from screaming, but it was a much more forgiving fall. Izuku did not speak. He just adjusted her so that she was cradled in his arms, holding her closer to his chest. She snuggled her face into his neck, exhausted and barely able to move. Silence filled the cavernous room, the intense heat so sweltering that it began to press on the bone-tired students as if it were a real weight. Where stories live. Discover now.